He wasn't just a Nazi officer, he was a symbol of fear. In the shadow of the Holocaust, his name became a warning whispered among prisoners. This is the story of how one man turned absolute power into pure cruelty, and how history refused to forget him. Amon Leopold Goeth was born on December 11, 1908 in Vienna, Austria, into a family that was strict and distant. His father, a civil servant, was known for being stern and demanding, while his mother was cold and emotionally unavailable. Growing up in this environment, Goeth learned early on that emotions didn't matter. What mattered was following rules and controlling everything around him. His father's strictness and his mother's emotional distance created an environment where Goeth never felt the warmth of love or affection. As a child, Goeth didn't show much interest in friendships or playing with others. Instead, he seemed to enjoy asserting control over those around him. Even as a boy, Goeth would sometimes bully others, finding satisfaction in making them afraid. His childhood wasn't filled with the usual joys and love. Instead, it was about dominance and control. These early signs would become important later, as they laid the groundwork for his cruelty in adulthood. His emotional isolation and desire for power would drive many of the decisions he made as an adult. Goeth's childhood was also shaped by the difficult political and economic conditions of Austria during and after World War I. Austria, like much of Europe, was in a state of chaos, with the economy struggling and the country reeling from its defeat in the war. As Goeth grew up, he saw his country torn apart by these struggles. He didn't experience the sense of unity and pride that other children might have in a more stable environment. Instead, Goeth was exposed to a world where power was everything and weakness was punished. This atmosphere of instability would make him more open to the ideas of the Nazi Party, which promised strength and control. His family's emotional coldness, along with the political chaos around him, meant Goeth grew up believing that power and control were the most important things in life. As he got older, he saw how the Nazi Party offered a solution to all the chaos around him. They spoke about national strength and racial superiority, which Goeth found appealing. He began to see himself as part of a larger movement, one that would bring order and control, even if it meant hurting others. His family life, marked by distance and control, mirrored the kind of world Goeth would eventually embrace. A world where power was everything. The rise of Nazism and Amon's path to the SS. As Goeth grew into adulthood, Austria was facing tough times. The country was still recovering from the devastation of World War I, and many people were angry and disillusioned. The Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler, was rising in popularity, offering promises of strength and a return to greatness. They spoke about purging the country of Jews and other minorities, and Goeth, like many others, was drawn to their message. The idea of a strong, unified country that controlled everything was exactly what Goeth wanted. The Nazis believed in the superiority of the Aryan race and the need to eliminate those they considered inferior. For Goeth, this ideology made perfect sense. He had always been taught that power mattered more than anything, and the Nazis seemed to promise that power. As he became more involved with the Nazi Party, Goeth's ideas about race and strength became more extreme. He didn't just agree with the Nazis, he fully embraced their ideas. He began to see Jews, Slavs, and other minorities as enemies who had to be eliminated for the Aryan race to survive. Goeth's path to the SS started as he became more involved with the Nazi Party. The SS, which started as Hitler's personal bodyguard, became the force responsible for carrying out the Nazis' violent policies. For Goeth, joining the SS was the next logical step. It gave him a chance to live out his belief in control and power, and it gave him the opportunity to enforce the Nazi ideology in a real, practical way. He wasn't just following orders, he was part of the machinery that would bring about the destruction of millions of people. By the time Goeth joined the SS, he had fully embraced the idea that Jews and other minorities had to be destroyed for the Aryan race to survive. His rise in the SS was quick, and soon he was given a position of power. He was ready to carry out the Nazi Party's orders, believing that the violence and murder were necessary for the survival of the German people. His loyalty to the Nazis was unshakable, and he was willing to do whatever it took to make their vision a reality. Early involvement in Nazi youth and the SS recruitment process. Goeth's involvement with the Nazi Party didn't start when he joined the SS. He had been introduced to Nazi ideals at a young age through the Nazi youth movement, which taught young people to hate Jews and follow Nazi ideals. The movement was designed to instill loyalty to the party and to teach children the importance of racial purity. For Goeth, this was the perfect environment. He was already raised with a sense of power and control, and the Nazi youth movement gave him a way to channel those feelings into something that felt important. He learned that the way to achieve power was through violence and domination, and this belief would stay with him as he grew older. As a young man, Goeth was deeply influenced by the lessons of the Nazi youth. He learned to view the world through the lens of superiority and hatred, seeing himself as part of a master race that had the right to rule over others. The Nazi youth taught him to see Jews as subhuman, and this belief would become central to his identity. Goeth didn't just join the Nazi Party because it was popular or powerful. He believed in its ideas with all his heart. He saw the elimination of Jews and other minorities as a moral duty, one that he was proud to carry out. When Goeth joined the SS, it was a natural progression from his earlier involvement in the Nazi youth. He had already been taught to hate and to believe in the superiority of the Aryan race, and the SS gave him the power to put these beliefs into action. The SS was a place where violence and cruelty were not just allowed, but encouraged. Goeth quickly adapted to this environment, using his growing authority to exert control over others. He became more ruthless and more committed to carrying out the Nazis' policies. The SS allowed him to live out his sadistic beliefs, and he quickly rose through the ranks. Goeth's early involvement with the SS was marked by his willingness to carry out violence without question. The SS didn't just train him in military tactics, it taught him how to be cold, calculating, and brutal. Goeth excelled in this environment, finding a sense of power and purpose in his ability to control and destroy. The SS gave him the tools he needed to carry out the Holocaust, and he embraced them fully. His early days in the SS were marked by his growing belief in the necessity of violence, and this belief would shape the rest of his life. The evolution of Goeth's sadistic ideology. Goeth's beliefs didn't simply come from the Nazi Party. They were shaped and evolved over time, turning into something much darker. Early on, Goeth embraced the idea of racial purity, believing that the Aryan race was superior to all others. However, as he became more involved in the SS and carried out more violent acts, his ideology began to shift. It wasn't enough for him to believe in the superiority of his race. He began to take pleasure in the suffering of others. The violence and cruelty that he once saw as necessary became a source of personal enjoyment. As Goeth's role in the SS grew, so did his sadism. The more power he gained, the more he reveled in the pain and terror he inflicted on others. He saw the murder of Jews and other minorities as an essential part of his identity. Goeth didn't just follow orders, he embraced the violence, taking pleasure in the fear and pain he caused. His ideology shifted from a cold belief in racial purity to a personal enjoyment of suffering. He began to see himself as a hero of the Nazi cause, someone who was helping to purify the world, even if it meant torturing and killing innocent people. Goeth's sadistic ideology became a driving force in his life. It was no longer about fulfilling a political goal. It was about his personal need for control and domination. He saw the world as a place where the strong must dominate the weak, and he became more determined to enforce that belief through violence. This evolution of Goeth's ideology was a key factor in his actions at Płaszów, where he would take personal pleasure in executing and torturing prisoners. For Goeth, the violence wasn't just a means to an end, it was the end itself. He believed that through violence, he could prove his superiority. This shift in Goeth's thinking made him a terrifying figure within the SS. He was no longer just a soldier following orders. He had become someone who enjoyed inflicting pain and suffering. His actions at Płaszów would later reflect this dark evolution. As Goeth embraced his role as an executioner, he became more dangerous. His sadism knew no bounds, and the suffering of others became his source of power. The more he engaged in violence, the more he believed it was his destiny to purge the world of what he saw as undesirables. Goeth's personality and early signs of cruelty. From an early age, Amon Goeth's personality showed signs of cruelty that would define his later life. He didn't just follow orders, he enjoyed making others suffer. There are stories from his time in the Nazi youth and early SS career that paint a clear picture of a young man who took pleasure in domination. He would often use his position to bully and intimidate those around him, and these early actions foreshadowed the horrors he would later commit. Goeth's desire for control was evident from the beginning. He didn't just want power, he wanted to destroy anyone who stood in his way. As Goeth rose through the ranks of the SS, his cruelty became more apparent. He didn't just see Jews and other minorities as enemies, he saw them as objects for his sadistic pleasures. His early signs of cruelty were a warning of what was to come. He didn't hesitate to use violence against those who were weaker than him. These actions weren't random, they were deliberate, a reflection of his growing belief in his own superiority and the need to control others. Goeth's early experiences in the SS only magnified these tendencies, making him more dangerous as time went on. By the time Goeth was appointed to run Płaszów, his personality had fully developed into one of ruthless cruelty. He had already shown that he was willing to kill and torture without hesitation. But at Płaszów, he was given the power to carry out these acts on a larger scale. His early signs of cruelty had evolved into a desire for domination and destruction. Goeth was no longer just a man with a violent streak. He had become a sadistic monster, someone who enjoyed inflicting pain and suffering on others. These early signs of cruelty would soon turn into the horrors of Płaszów. The Goeth, who would terrorize thousands of Jews at Płaszów, was already taking shape in his younger years. His desire for power, his lack of empathy, and his belief in racial superiority were all part of the personality that would make him one of the most feared figures in Nazi history. The early signs of Goeth's cruelty weren't just part of his personality, they were the foundation for everything he would become. In 1942, the Nazis set up the Płaszów concentration camp on the outskirts of Krakow, Poland. Initially, it was intended as a labor camp, but under the command of Amon Goeth, it would become a symbol of fear and death. Goeth was a man known for his coldness, his quick rise within the SS, and his unwavering loyalty to the Nazi regime. He wasn't picked for his leadership skills, but rather for his ruthless efficiency in carrying out the horrors of the Nazi ideology. Goeth's appointment to Płaszów shocked even the seasoned officers of the SS. He wasn't particularly well liked, nor was he seen as a man of distinction. But he was ruthless. He didn't need to have the charm of other SS officers. He had something far more dangerous, a heartless dedication to terror. Goeth's assignment was simple: run Płaszów as a place where fear and suffering were to be constant, a place where the prisoners could be broken, crushed, and disposed of at will. The camp, located in a desolate area, quickly became one of the most notorious in Nazi-occupied Poland. With the arrival of Goeth, things would only get worse for the prisoners. His very presence in the camp meant one thing: absolute control through fear. His first order of business wasn't to improve camp conditions, but to break the prisoners' spirits. Goeth knew that terror was the quickest way to gain compliance, and he used it mercilessly. Soon, Goeth turned Płaszów into a prison of horrors, a place where death wasn't just a result of the war. It was a constant, looming threat. The prisoners didn't just live in fear of work or starvation, but of Goeth himself. He had no interest in their suffering other than the fact that it gave him power. The camp, once a hopeful location for the survival of the displaced Jews, became a nightmare under his iron-fisted control. Goeth's reign at Płaszów marked the beginning of a brutal chapter in the lives of those trapped inside the camp. For the prisoners, his arrival signified not just hardship, it meant a personal nightmare. They knew that anyone could become the next target for his random outbursts of violence. In a place where survival was already a struggle, Goeth's cruelty turned Płaszów into a symbol of hopelessness. From the moment Goeth took command, life at Płaszów became a daily fight for survival. The conditions inside the camp were hellish. Prisoners were crammed into barracks that were overcrowded, unsanitary, and riddled with disease. There was no hope for comfort, no hope for kindness. Goeth made sure of that. His first act was to set the tone. Nothing in Płaszów would be easy for the prisoners. Not even the smallest moments of peace. Goeth's leadership was defined by his unpredictability and violence. He didn't just order punishments, he made them personal. His method was simple: terror. Every prisoner knew that at any moment they could be dragged from their barracks and beaten, tortured, or shot. Goeth would often walk through the camp, a looming figure of dread, his gaze piercing every corner. The air was heavy with fear. No one could escape his wrath. One of Goeth's most effective methods of control was his casual cruelty. Prisoners didn't know whether they would live or die from one moment to the next. He would pick out someone in the crowd for no reason at all and either beat them mercilessly or simply execute them on the spot. This was not about punishment. It was about maintaining power. Goeth wanted his prisoners to know that at any moment, their lives could be snuffed out without a thought. The randomness of the violence made it even more terrifying. No one could predict when they would be the next target. Goeth also employed a brutal tactic where he would force prisoners to work long hours with minimal food or rest. The physical exhaustion was crushing, but even worse was the constant threat that any small mistake would cost someone their life. Drop a tool, speak out of turn, or simply be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Each of these things could lead to death. Goeth didn't need a reason. The reason was always the same: to remind them who was in control. But the true horror of life at Płaszów wasn't just the beatings or the executions. It was the way Goeth controlled the minds of those around him. His cruel acts left psychological scars, breaking prisoners down in ways that physical punishment alone couldn't. Prisoners learned to fear not just the beating, but the man himself, and this fear permeated every action they took. It was a system built on terror, and Goeth was its architect. Amon Goeth wasn't just an administrator, he was a killer. He took a personal, active role in the violence that marked life in Płaszów. One of his most infamous acts was shooting prisoners from the balcony of his residence. Goeth would stand on the balcony of his house overlooking the camp, rifle in hand, and simply pick out victims. He didn't need a reason to kill. He simply did it for the satisfaction it gave him, a power trip like no other. The balcony shootings became a symbol of the terror prisoners faced. Goeth would casually watch as people went about their business. Then suddenly, without warning, he would shoot. Sometimes it was one person. Sometimes it was several. His lack of emotion, the cold way he did it, was a testament to the depths of his cruelty. The prisoners, seeing this, knew that even the smallest infraction could lead to a bullet in their back. The thought of being chosen by Goeth for execution was always in the back of their minds. But Goeth didn't just kill from a distance. He was personally involved in the torture of the prisoners. He would often order brutal beatings, pulling people out of line for no reason at all, and watching as they were brutally punished. His sadism knew no bounds. Goeth took pleasure in the pain of others. If a prisoner looked at him wrong or failed to meet his expectations, they would face unimaginable pain. Goeth's cruelty wasn't random, it was deliberate. He carefully crafted an environment where the only constant was fear. One prisoner recalled being dragged to Goeth's office for a simple misunderstanding. Goeth ordered the man to kneel, and without hesitation, he shot him in the knee, just for sport. Another prisoner was ordered to stand on his toes for hours, with the threat of death if he faltered. It wasn't about the crime, it was about breaking them, making them feel powerless, humiliated. Goeth wasn't just killing bodies, he was killing spirits too. The balcony shootings were only a glimpse of the depths of Goeth's sadism. He would enter the camp with his rifle and shoot anyone he deemed unworthy of life. His personal involvement in the killings made them even more chilling. He wasn't just an administrator of death, he was an active participant, delighting in the terror he spread. His cruelty became legendary. The victims may have been countless, but for Goeth, it was never about the numbers. It was about control, domination, and his enjoyment of the suffering he caused. Goeth's reign of terror at Płaszów wasn't just about personal cruelty. It was part of the larger Nazi system designed to systematically eliminate entire populations. Goeth's role in the Holocaust was as much about compliance with the Nazi machine as it was about his personal enjoyment of violence. Under his command, Płaszów became one of the key sites of the final solution, a place where Jews were not just imprisoned, but subjected to systematic and deliberate cruelty. As commandant, Goeth had direct control over who lived and who died. Prisoners were transported to Płaszów from various ghettos, and under Goeth's rule, many were sent straight to their deaths. The camp served as a transit point to other extermination camps like Auschwitz. Goeth didn't just oversee their transportation, he was actively involved in the selection process. He was responsible for sending thousands to their deaths, marking him as a direct participant in the mass murder of Jews. Płaszów was also a place where the Nazi regime's racial ideology was enforced to its extreme. Goeth followed orders without question, and the camp became a microcosm of the larger extermination efforts happening across Nazi-occupied Europe. Prisoners at Płaszów were treated as expendable. Their lives weighed against the Nazi ideology of racial purity. For Goeth, the camp wasn't just a site of forced labor. It was a place where the racial hierarchy of the Nazis was enforced through death. In the broader context of the Holocaust, Goeth's actions were part of a calculated effort to rid Europe of Jews, Romani people, disabled individuals, and other undesirables. His participation in the mass murder was not an anomaly. It was a cog in the greater machinery of extermination. Goeth didn't just commit isolated atrocities. He was an enforcer of a system designed to systematically wipe out entire communities. Amon Goeth's control over the prisoners was not just physical, it was mental. He understood the power of fear and used it to break the prisoners' spirits. The mere thought of encountering Goeth on the grounds sent waves of terror through the camp. He could make a prisoner's life unbearable with just a look or a word. His cruelty wasn't just about violence, it was about total psychological domination. Prisoners who survived Płaszów often recalled the constant fear of Goeth. It wasn't only the acts of violence that haunted them, it was the psychological toll of knowing that death could come at any moment, without warning. Goeth's unpredictability made him even more terrifying. He didn't have to kill everyone to inspire fear. Just his presence was enough. Goeth's ability to control with fear was central to his reign. Prisoners were conditioned to live in a state of constant dread. They knew that any mistake, no matter how small, could lead to punishment. It wasn't just physical suffering, it was the toll it took on their minds. Many survivors spoke of the emotional scars they carried with them long after they left the camp. The fear Goeth instilled didn't just disappear when the war ended. It stayed with them, shaping their memories and their futures. Goeth's power lay not just in his cruelty, but in his ability to make the prisoners feel utterly powerless. He took away their sense of control, making them feel like they were nothing. For Goeth, that was the ultimate form of punishment, breaking the spirit so completely that there was nothing left to fight for. It was this psychological grip that made Płaszów one of the most feared camps in the Nazi system. Oskar Schindler first arrived at Płaszów in 1942, driven by his desire to profit from the war by using Jewish labor. He was a businessman, a member of the Nazi Party, and a man with no initial interest in the suffering around him. Schindler established an enamelware factory in the area, using Jewish workers from the nearby concentration camp to produce goods for the German army. His motives were clear: make money, use cheap labor, and support the war effort. When Schindler arrived, Płaszów was already a place of horror, ruled by Amon Goeth's ruthless command. Goeth was a man driven by sadistic tendencies, and the camp had become a symbol of fear and violence. Schindler, at first, saw the prisoners as a resource, an opportunity to get ahead. However, upon seeing the brutal conditions they were enduring under Goeth's rule, he began to question the system he was operating within. At first, Schindler's relationship with Goeth was purely transactional. He needed labor for his factory, and Goeth needed to keep the prisoners in line, making them work for the Nazi war machine. But it didn't take long for Schindler to witness the cruelty that Goeth inflicted upon the prisoners, something that began to weigh on his conscience. As Schindler's factory grew, so did his realization that he could do more to help those in the camp. Schindler didn't immediately act on his growing awareness, but he started making small changes. He took note of the prisoners who were selected for the hardest labor, or who were sent to be executed for trivial offenses. It became clear to him that what was happening at Płaszów was not just an expression of Nazi control, it was a deliberate campaign to destroy lives. Schindler began to look at his workers not just as employees, but as human beings who deserved a chance at survival. In the beginning, Schindler wasn't a rescuer, he was a businessman. But by the time he began interacting with the prisoners, his perspective shifted. What started as a financial venture grew into something much more personal. Schindler realized that by offering his workers a semblance of safety in his factory, he had the power to save lives. This realization set the stage for the dramatic shift in his priorities. From profit to protection, Schindler's factory quickly became more than just a place of work. It became a rare refuge for the Jews of Płaszów. As the camp's conditions worsened, Schindler used his factory to provide his workers with a safer environment. While the conditions in the factory were far from comfortable, they were nothing compared to the brutality of life in the camp. Schindler's workers were spared from the random killings, the harsh punishments, and the constant fear that ruled Płaszów. The factory was strategically positioned as a place where Schindler could keep his workers out of the direct line of Goeth's violence. He used his influence within the Nazi Party to secure better treatment for his workers, negotiating with Goeth to prevent his most valuable workers from being sent to their deaths. The factory didn't offer full immunity, but for the workers who labored there, it represented a lifeline, a chance to survive, however slim that chance might have been. But Schindler didn't stop at just providing a safer place to work. He also began to advocate for his workers in more profound ways. He would occasionally intervene to protect them from Goeth's wrath, using his charm to convince Goeth that certain individuals were essential for the war effort. This delicate dance of persuasion and manipulation became a defining characteristic of Schindler's relationship with the commandant. He had to carefully balance his position, always mindful that Goeth was not an ally, but a threat. Schindler's factory was also a place where prisoners could find small moments of dignity in an otherwise dehumanizing environment. While Schindler couldn't end the war or halt the Nazis' genocidal policies, he could offer a form of humanity in an otherwise inhumane world. In this small corner of the Holocaust, he was able to create a space where Jewish workers were treated as individuals, not just expendable resources. By the time the war was winding down, Schindler's factory had saved the lives of over 1,000 Jews. Though the situation was far from ideal, the factory was their best shot at survival. Schindler's factory became a symbol of resistance, not just to the Nazis, but to the idea that survival was only for the strongest or the most ruthless. It showed that there was still room for compassion, even in the darkest of times. As Schindler's influence within Płaszów grew, so did the tension between him and Amon Goeth. Goeth's sadistic reign was built on control, violence, and fear, and Schindler's actions were a direct challenge to that system. Goeth saw Schindler as a man who was not only defying Nazi law, but also undermining his authority within the camp. To Goeth, Schindler was a traitor to the cause, someone who was standing in the way of the total destruction of the Jews. Schindler, however, saw Goeth as a man consumed by hatred and violence, someone whose cruelty had no boundaries. As Goeth's actions became more violent and his cruelty more personal, Schindler found himself increasingly at odds with him. The two men could not have been more different. Where Goeth saw Jews as objects to be discarded, Schindler began to see them as human beings worthy of life. The conflict between the two men escalated as Schindler's factory continued to grow. Goeth became more enraged by Schindler's efforts to protect the Jews, and Schindler began to understand the depths of Goeth's sadism. Goeth would often lash out at Schindler's workers, punishing them for any slight, no matter how small. For Schindler, each instance of cruelty by Goeth only made him more determined to protect the lives of his workers. Their relationship was fraught with tension, as Schindler tried to navigate the dangerous waters between his moral obligations and the ever-present threat of Goeth's violence. Schindler wasn't a revolutionary. He wasn't leading an armed resistance against the Nazis, but he was doing everything in his power to protect the lives of those around him. The more Goeth's actions became extreme, the more Schindler became determined to counteract them. While Goeth grew increasingly jealous of Schindler's growing influence and success, Schindler continued his work quietly and with great risk. He understood that his survival in this environment depended on his ability to manipulate Goeth, to keep him appeased just enough so that he wouldn't retaliate against Schindler's efforts. It was a high-stakes game of survival, where every decision had the potential to turn deadly. Schindler's impact on the prisoners of Płaszów was profound. To them, he was not just a man who saved them from physical death. He gave them back their dignity. In a place where they were treated like cattle, Schindler saw them as human beings. This simple act of recognition made all the difference. It was a small but significant defiance against the dehumanization that the Nazis tried to impose on them. Schindler didn't just offer them work in his factory. He offered them the opportunity to hold on to their humanity. In a world where every other opportunity was stripped away, where people were beaten and killed for the smallest offenses, Schindler's workers were given a semblance of normalcy. They could work, earn some money, and at least for a time, feel like their lives still had meaning. But Schindler's actions went beyond mere protection. He saw his workers as individuals. He worked tirelessly to ensure their safety, constantly fighting for their survival in the face of overwhelming odds. His influence spread through the camp as more and more people came to see him as their protector. Schindler's actions showed the prisoners that even in a world as dark as Płaszów, there was still room for hope. He was far from perfect, and his decisions were not without flaws. But Schindler's efforts to humanize the prisoners of Płaszów were a crucial part of their survival. He was a man who took great personal risks, constantly walking a tightrope between doing what was morally right and keeping his position safe in a brutal, unforgiving regime. His impact on the prisoners was immeasurable, and for many of them, he was the difference between life and death. In the end, Schindler's work wasn't just about saving Jews from death. It was about restoring their sense of self-worth. In a camp where the Nazis sought to erase the humanity of their victims, Schindler gave them a reason to live, to believe that they were more than just numbers. That alone made his actions revolutionary. As Schindler's influence continued to grow, so did Goeth's anger. Goeth saw Schindler as a challenge to the very core of Nazi ideology. He couldn't understand why a Nazi party member, someone who was supposed to uphold the ideals of racial purity, would protect Jews. To Goeth, this was nothing short of treason. He saw Schindler's actions as a direct insult to everything he stood for. Schindler's growing success, his ability to protect the Jews in the face of Goeth's violence, became a source of deep resentment for the commandant. Schindler, however, wasn't about to back down. He had already crossed a line by protecting his workers, and there was no turning back now. As Goeth's jealousy and anger increased, so did Schindler's resolve to protect those under his care. The relationship between the two men became a dangerous game of cat and mouse, each trying to outmaneuver the other. Schindler knew that he couldn't win a fight against Goeth through force. He had to rely on his wit, his influence, and his ability to manipulate the system. Goeth's violent reactions to Schindler's actions became more frequent. He would lash out at Schindler's workers, punishing them for any minor mistake. Schindler, however, continued to do what he could to protect them, using every opportunity to shield them from Goeth's wrath. The two men, both deeply entrenched in their worldviews, were on a collision course. Goeth wanted to destroy Schindler's efforts, while Schindler fought not just for survival, but for the humanity of those in the camp. This dynamic between Schindler and Goeth was a microcosm of the larger struggle between good and evil. Schindler, a Nazi Party member who had turned against the regime's core values, was fighting for the lives of those the Nazis sought to exterminate. Goeth, a sadistic enforcer of Nazi ideology, wanted to maintain his control no matter the cost. The tension between the two men defined the atmosphere of the camp as the battle for survival continued. In the end, Schindler's quiet rebellion against Goeth's terror became one of the most remarkable acts of resistance within the Nazi system. Schindler wasn't a soldier or a fighter, but his fight for the lives of those he protected proved to be just as important, if not more so. In the face of Goeth's anger and violence, Schindler showed that there was still room for compassion, even in the darkest of places. By early 1945, the war was winding down. The Soviet army was closing in on Krakow, and the Nazis knew they were losing control. Płaszów, which had been a site of terror, was now in danger of falling to the Allies. The prisoners inside were aware that something was changing, but they didn't know what would happen next. As the Soviets moved closer, the camp was in chaos, and Goeth, the cruel commandant, saw the writing on the wall. He knew the end was near, and he was ready to do anything to escape justice. Goeth, desperate to avoid capture, made a swift decision. He didn't wait for the final liberation. He abandoned Płaszów and fled before the Soviet troops arrived. His escape was quiet as the camp leaders scrambled to cover their tracks. Goeth, now a man on the run, disappeared into the turmoil of the retreating German forces. He left the prisoners behind, as if they were nothing more than pawns. They had endured his cruelty for so long, and now he was running, hoping to escape the inevitable punishment that was catching up to him. The prisoners were left in a mix of disbelief and fear. Goeth had been their tormentor, the embodiment of their suffering, and now he was gone. For a moment, there was relief, but that quickly turned to uncertainty. The Soviet forces were coming, but they didn't know if they would be freed or if something even worse might happen. The camp was left in confusion, with Goeth's absence offering no immediate comfort. The liberation was approaching, but it felt hollow with Goeth's departure. While Goeth tried to blend into the chaos of a collapsing Nazi regime, the world was already closing in on him. His escape didn't last long. Goeth couldn't hide forever. The Allies were determined to find him and bring him to trial for the horrors he had inflicted on countless lives. His time in hiding was short, but it bought him no freedom. The world he had created with his terror was crumbling, and there was nowhere left for him to run. The liberation of Płaszów was a turning point for the prisoners. The man who had ruled their lives with violence and fear was gone, but his legacy lingered. The Soviet forces arrived soon after Goeth's flight, freeing the prisoners, but the scars of his rule would never be erased. The man who had been their nightmare was now a fugitive, but justice would eventually catch up with him. After the war ended, the hunt for Nazi war criminals began. Goeth, who had fled Płaszów as the war was coming to an end, thought he could escape the consequences of his actions. But the Allies were determined to find those responsible for the atrocities of the Holocaust, and Goeth was high on their list. He had lived in hiding, moving from place to place, hoping to blend in with the chaos of a war-torn Europe. But the truth about his crimes was well known, and it wasn't long before the search for him intensified. In 1945, Goeth was finally located by American forces. They found him in the countryside, hiding among a group of German soldiers who were fleeing the advancing Allied forces. Goeth had tried to vanish, but his name had already become infamous. The survivors of Płaszów and others who had witnessed his brutality had made sure that he wouldn't be forgotten. His face was known, and his crimes were too terrible to remain hidden for long. The Allies were determined to bring him to justice, and Goeth could no longer escape. Once captured, Goeth was handed over to Polish authorities, who were tasked with putting him on trial for his war crimes. He had no choice but to face the consequences of his actions. For years, he had ruled Płaszów with an iron fist, causing suffering and death. Now, he was facing a trial that would hold him accountable for the horrors he had inflicted on so many innocent people. His capture was a moment of justice for the survivors, who had lived with the trauma of his cruelty for so long. His capture marked the beginning of the end for the man who had brought so much pain to countless lives. The Allies were determined to see him tried for his war crimes, and they weren't about to let him slip away again. Goeth's capture was a victory for the survivors of Płaszów and for all those who had suffered under the Nazi regime. Though Goeth thought he could escape, his capture showed that no one, no matter how powerful or how cruel, could avoid justice forever. His crimes had caught up with him, and he would face the consequences. The search for him had been long, but it ended with his capture, bringing a sense of closure to the survivors of Płaszów and the world at large. Amon Goeth's trial began in 1946, just over a year after World War II had ended. Goeth, who had been captured by the American forces after fleeing Płaszów, now faced a court where he would have to answer for his many crimes. The trial was held in Krakow, Poland, and it became one of the most important moments for the survivors of Płaszów and all those affected by the Holocaust. This was their chance to see the man who had tortured, killed, and caused so much pain face justice. The courtroom was filled with survivors, some who had been directly affected by Goeth's actions, and others who had heard the stories of his brutality. They came forward to speak about what they had endured under Goeth's reign at the Płaszów camp. These survivors were the key to bringing Goeth to trial. Their testimonies would become the foundation of the evidence presented against him. In the trial, several survivors gave emotional accounts of the horrors they had witnessed while Goeth was in charge. Some had been forced to work in the camp's terrible conditions, where they were made to do exhausting labor under constant threat of death. Others told of the executions Goeth had carried out with no reason or explanation. Goeth's cruel actions were not limited to just killing, though. Many survivors shared stories of how they had been tortured, starved, and humiliated by him. Goeth didn't just oversee these atrocities. He took pleasure in them. One of the most shocking testimonies came from those who had seen Goeth shoot people from the balcony of his home. He would watch the prisoners below, and if they displeased him in any way, he would randomly select someone and shoot them in cold blood. These executions became a regular occurrence during his time at Płaszów, and the prisoners learned to live in constant fear. They knew that at any moment they could become the next target of Goeth's unpredictable violence. It was clear from these testimonies that Goeth had no empathy for the people he was supposed to oversee. He was a man who enjoyed inflicting pain, and the survivors who spoke out made sure the world knew it. The photographs presented at the trial were another powerful form of evidence. Many of the survivors had managed to capture images of the camp's brutal conditions and the crimes that were being committed there. These photos showed the crowded barracks, the malnourished prisoners, and the inhumane conditions that Goeth had allowed to continue unchecked. The images also depicted the executions and other violent acts carried out by Goeth and his officers. These photographs helped paint a vivid picture of the terror that was a daily part of life in Płaszów under Goeth's command. The historical records also played a crucial role in the trial. Documents from the Nazi regime, including orders that Goeth had signed, showed that he was not acting on his own, but was an active participant in the larger system of Nazi oppression. The records also revealed that Goeth had played a key role in the deportation of Jews from Krakow to Płaszów, where they would later be sent to death camps. These records were important because they showed that Goeth was not just a camp commandant, but a direct enforcer of the policies that led to the deaths of millions of people. The evidence against Goeth was overwhelming. There were numerous accounts from survivors, photographs of the atrocities, and historical records that clearly linked Goeth to the crimes committed at Płaszów and beyond. Yet, despite all this evidence, Goeth's response to the charges was not one of remorse or guilt. During his trial, Goeth's defense was built on a claim that he was simply following orders. He argued that as an officer in the Nazi regime, he had been ordered to carry out certain tasks and had no choice but to obey. This argument, commonly used by many Nazi war criminals after the war, was that they were just doing their jobs, following the orders of higher authorities. Goeth tried to present himself as a man who was simply fulfilling his duty as a soldier. But this defense quickly fell apart in the face of the overwhelming evidence against him. The survivors who testified against him didn't just speak of his actions as a camp commandant. They spoke of his personal involvement in the murders, tortures, and sadistic acts. They described how Goeth enjoyed the power he had over the prisoners and how he went beyond simply obeying orders. He personally executed prisoners and punished them for the smallest offenses. His cruelty wasn't just a result of being a Nazi officer. It was a reflection of his personal desire for power and control. Goeth's psychological evaluation played a key role in the trial. Psychiatrists and experts were brought in to assess his mental state. Their job was to determine if Goeth's actions were the result of a psychological disorder, or if he was simply a sadistic, cold-hearted individual. The conclusion was clear. Goeth was not insane. He wasn't acting under the influence of a mental illness. He was a man who had embraced Nazi ideology and had become a willing participant in the terror he inflicted on others. The evaluation showed that Goeth was fully aware of his actions. He had no remorse for the pain he caused, and he took pleasure in the suffering of others. His sadism wasn't the result of a mental disorder. It was a reflection of his personality and worldview. Goeth believed in the Nazi ideals of racial superiority, and he viewed Jews, Slavs, and other minorities as less than human. This belief allowed him to commit atrocities without feeling guilt or responsibility for the lives he destroyed. Goeth's defense strategy, which tried to shift blame to the higher-ups in the Nazi regime, failed to convince the court. His actions were not those of a man following orders. He actively participated in and even sought out opportunities to harm others. The court didn't see him as a pawn in a larger system. They saw him as an active and willing participant in the atrocities of the Holocaust. His lack of empathy and sadistic behavior were a key part of the evidence against him. While many war criminals tried to defend themselves by claiming they were just following orders, Goeth's case was different. His actions went far beyond what was expected of him as an officer. He was not merely carrying out the orders of others. He was relishing the power he had over the lives of others. His sadistic enjoyment of violence made him one of the most feared figures of the Holocaust. The psychological evaluation confirmed what the survivors already knew. Goeth was not a man who had been manipulated by circumstances. He was a man who willingly embraced the cruelty and violence of the Nazi regime. In the end, Goeth's defense did little to change the outcome of the trial. The evidence, the testimonies of the survivors, and the psychological evaluation all pointed to one undeniable truth. Amon Goeth was guilty. His sadistic tendencies, his lack of remorse, and his active role in the Nazi regime's atrocities made him one of the most notorious war criminals to stand trial. Goeth's defense may have been his attempt to avoid responsibility, but the truth was clear. He was a man who chose cruelty and hatred over humanity. Amon Goeth's trial in 1946 ended with the conviction of one of the most brutal figures of the Holocaust. He was found guilty of war crimes, including mass murder, torture, and the systematic oppression of the prisoners at Płaszów. The court's verdict was clear. Goeth was responsible for the suffering and deaths of thousands of innocent people. The evidence against him was overwhelming, with survivor testimonies and photographs showing the horrors he had inflicted. Despite his defense, which tried to argue that he was only following orders, the tribunal held him accountable for his crimes. Goeth was sentenced to death by hanging. The sentence was a moment of justice, but for many survivors, it did not bring complete closure. The pain Goeth had caused couldn't be erased by his death, but the fact that he would finally face the consequences of his actions was an important milestone in the pursuit of justice for the victims of the Holocaust. Goeth's death would be a symbolic end to his reign of terror, but it was just one piece in the larger effort to bring Nazi war criminals to trial. His execution was necessary for the survivors and for the world to show that no one, no matter how powerful or cruel, could escape responsibility for their actions. Goeth's execution took place on September 13, 1946, in Krakow, Poland. He was hanged near the very camp where he had committed so many atrocities. It was a simple but symbolic moment, marking the end of Goeth's life and the beginning of a long-awaited reckoning for his crimes. For many of the prisoners who had survived Płaszów, Goeth's execution was a bittersweet victory. While they had longed for justice, the pain and trauma they carried would never go away. Survivors of the camp, many of whom had witnessed Goeth's sadistic behavior firsthand, found some comfort in knowing that the man responsible for so much suffering would no longer walk free. But the scars Goeth had left on them, both physical and emotional, remained long after his death. However, Goeth's legacy remains a stain on history. His crimes were not isolated to Płaszów. He was a part of the broader Nazi ideology that sought to exterminate millions of innocent people. While Goeth's execution was an important step in holding him accountable, his legacy continues to haunt the world. His name is forever associated with the cruelty and inhumanity of the Holocaust, a reminder of the depths of evil that can be reached when people believe they have the right to dehumanize others. The survivors of Płaszów and the families of those who perished under Goeth's watch were left with a lifetime of memories they could never escape. Goeth's execution did not undo the violence he had done to their lives. His legacy is a painful one, and it is carried by the survivors who live with the trauma of his reign of terror. While Goeth's death provided a sense of closure for some, it did nothing to erase the scars left by his actions. In the end, Goeth's execution was a reminder that no matter how powerful a person may be, they are still subject to the consequences of their actions. It was a small victory in the fight for justice for the victims of the Holocaust, but it was not the end of their journey. Goeth's death didn't erase the trauma, but it sent a message. No one can escape responsibility for the suffering they cause. And for those who survived, Goeth's execution was an acknowledgement of their pain and a recognition that justice, though delayed, would eventually come.